Welcome to Audio Insight, where we uncover the slow-burning collapses, the hidden fractures, and the power games global media only notices when it is already too late. The United Arab Emirates was never supposed to dominate anything. Not a continent, not a war zone, not the Red Sea, not the future of the Middle East. This is a country with a total population of roughly 11 million. And yet, somehow, this tiny Gulf monarchy tried to punch like an empire. Not with mass armies, not with ideology, not with history, but with something colder. Money, ports, intelligence, contractors, militias, plausible deniability. For years, it looked brilliant. A port deal here, a militia there, a discreet runway on a forgotten island, a handshake in a presidential palace. A gold route nobody asked too many questions about. And piece by piece, Abu Dhabi built something that looked terrifyingly modern. An empire with no flag, a network with no fingerprints, power without ownership, control without responsibility. But then, something just broke. Because the world the UAE needed in order to survive, a world of blurred lines, silent partners, and endless geopolitical distraction, is disappearing. Sudan is still burning in one of the world's worst wars. The Bab el-Mandeb and Red Sea corridor, one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth, has been repeatedly destabilized. And in a region where trade routes, ports, and perception are everything, even a small crack can become a strategic death sentence. That is the part most people still do not understand. The UAE did not build a normal sphere of influence. It built a shadow architecture, a system that depended on other people fighting, other people dying, other people staying divided, and most of all, other governments staying too distracted to stop it. But what happens when the shadows get exposed? What happens when the proxies become liabilities? When the ports become evidence? When the alliances you thought were temporary tools suddenly become permanent enemies? And worst of all, what happens when a country that sells itself as the region's ultimate safe haven starts to look dangerously exposed? Because that is the real threat here. Not just battlefield losses, not just diplomatic embarrassment, not even the collapse of one proxy army or one deal. The real threat is perception. The UAE's economic model depends on the belief that it is stable, clean, efficient, untouchable, a glittering exception in a collapsing region. So what if that image is cracking? What if the superpower was never a superpower at all? What if the empire was never real, only rented? In tonight's breakdown, we are going deep into the rise and possible unraveling of the Emirati shadow empire. How did a country this small reach so far into Yemen, Sudan, Libya, and the Horn of Africa? Why did that strategy look genius right up until it started looking suicidal? And why do the latest regional shifts suggest that what we are watching may not be a temporary setback, but the beginning of a historic rollback? Because if the old Emirati playbook is failing, then somebody else is about to fill the vacuum. Saudi Arabia? Turkey? Pakistan? A new regional axis? Or something far more chaotic? And buried inside this story is a deeper warning. A warning about modern power itself. About what happens when a state becomes rich enough to influence wars, but too small to control the consequences. About what happens when strategy outruns demographics. When ambition outruns legitimacy. When shadow power finally meets daylight. And in 2026, with the region already under extreme stress, that daylight may be turning into a firestorm. So before we get into the first collapse, before we trace the deals, the proxies, the ports, and the betrayals, there is one question you need to keep in your mind the entire time. Did the UAE build the future of power? Or did it build the perfect illusion just before the illusion shattered? Because the first domino did not fall in a palace. It fell on the edge of a war zone, and once it moved, everything else started moving with it. To understand how this started falling apart, you first have to understand how absurd the whole thing was in the first place. The UAE is a small state with outsized reach. That is what made the Emirati model so seductive. It looked like the future, a state too small to dominate by population, too exposed to dominate by geography, too dependent on foreigners to dominate by mass mobilization. And yet, it found a workaround. It turned infrastructure into leverage, trade into access, access into influence, influence into coercion. At the center of that strategy were ports. That part is not conspiracy. It is the visible skeleton of the whole project. DP World became one of the most important instruments of Emirati reach, from Jebel Ali to Berbera, building commercial footholds that also created political leverage over trade routes and coastlines. And Berbera was not just a business story. It sat near one of the world's most sensitive maritime corridors, the Gulf of Aden and the approaches to the Bab el-Mandeb. So when Abu Dhabi invested in ports, logistics, airstrips, and coastal access across the Horn and the Red Sea Arc, it was not just building trade, it was building options. And then came Yemen. This is where the Shadow Empire became impossible to ignore. For years, the UAE cultivated the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, a separatist force in southern Yemen. The relationship gave Abu Dhabi local muscle, local legitimacy in the south, and a proxy positioned right beside some of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth. The logic was brutally simple. Why send large Emirati formations into a grinding regional war when you can fund, train, equip, and politically shield local forces that fight for your interests instead? Why own the territory when controlling the gate is enough? Why carry the flag when everyone already knows who pays the bills? And for a while, it worked. The UAE appeared disciplined, efficient, surgical. Not loud like old empires, not ideological like revolutionary powers, not chaotic like failing republics, just cold, focused, transactional. But that was also the flaw, because shadow empires are built on borrowed loyalties, and borrowed loyalties expire. The STC may have served Emirati interests, but it also had its own agenda: southern independence, local control, and power on its own terms. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, had overlapping but not identical goals in Yemen. Riyadh wanted a buffer against the Houthis and a manageable southern front. Abu Dhabi wanted influence through local clients. Those are not the same thing. That is the first big truth most viewers miss. The UAE did not lose influence only because its enemies pushed back. It also started losing because its partners no longer accepted the terms, and Yemen was only one front. Now shift to Sudan. There, the Emirati model became even darker. The war in Sudan is one of the most devastating conflicts on Earth right now. And once atrocities reach a certain level, once they cross into the language of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possible genocide, every outside patron faces a new problem. Secrecy stops protecting you. Because now the question is no longer, can this proxy deliver results? The question becomes, what is the political cost of being associated with it? Then there was the Horn of Africa, another place where the UAE tried to turn access into dominance. In Somaliland, Emirati involvement through DP World and security links gave Abu Dhabi a long-term stake in a region that sits beside one of the most contested maritime spaces in the world. Then the backlash hit hard. One of the central pillars of Emirati influence in the Horn was now openly contested, politicized, and tied to sovereignty backlash. Think about that. A port empire only works if the surrounding governments tolerate it. A shadow network only works if enough actors prefer ambiguity over confrontation. A proxy system only works if the map stays blurred. But what happens when the map suddenly sharpens? What happens when states begin drawing red lines? What happens when the same playbook that once looked clever starts looking intolerable? And that is why the UAE's rise contained the seeds of its own collapse from the beginning. Because every victory depended on a balancing act. Saudi Arabia tolerating what it did not fully control. Local militias obeying while still dreaming their own dreams. African partners accepting investment without fearing domination. Global markets rewarding the UAE's image while ignoring the conflicts beneath it. That balancing act can last for years, until one day, it doesn't. And when it breaks, it does not break gradually. It breaks everywhere at once. Yemen starts slipping. Sudan becomes toxic. The Horn turns hostile. And suddenly, the empire that looked frictionless begins to look frighteningly thin. Because the first real test of the Emirati model was no longer whether it could expand. It was whether it could survive the moment its own proxies stopped being assets and started becoming evidence. So now we get to the part where the story stops sounding like theory and starts looking like evidence. Because every shadow empire survives on the same lie. That nothing can ever be proven. That no single route, no contract, no proxy, no shipment, no diplomatic alignment ever adds up to a complete picture. That the system is too complicated for outsiders to see. But by 2026, the pieces were no longer scattered. They were starting to line up. Start with the basic architecture of Emirati power. The country is wealthy, globally connected, and built around foreign labor, foreign expertise, and international capital. That sounds like a strength until you understand what kind of strength it is. It is not the strength of deep reserves. It is not the strength of mass citizenship. It is not the strength of a nation that can absorb prolonged regional shock and simply keep marching. It is the strength of connectivity. And connectivity is powerful, but fragile. Because if your leverage depends on logistics, then every disrupted corridor hurts. If your influence depends on business confidence, then every scandal costs more than a battlefield defeat. If your foreign policy depends on using local actors, then every proxy carries the risk of turning into a witness. That is why Sudan matters so much in this story. By early 2026, the international narrative around Sudan was getting darker, not lighter, and the timing could not have been worse. The RSF was not just accused of abuses, it was accused of atrocities on a scale that triggered genocide language. Read that again. Not just a messy civil war, not just a morally ambiguous battlefield, but the kind of violence that poisons everyone standing too close to it. And if a proxy becomes internationally associated with genocidal violence, then the patron is no longer playing chess. The patron is standing in a courtroom of perception with nowhere to hide. This is where the original illusion starts cracking. Because the UAE's model always sold itself as clean, efficient, technocratic, a precision player, a stabilizer, a state that could shape outcomes without sinking into the mud of failed wars. But Sudan exposed the opposite possibility. That shadow influence does not stay clean forever. That the gold routes, air corridors, and militia networks eventually drag the sponsor into the moral debris of the conflict itself. So even if Abu Dhabi denies the claims, the strategic damage is already real. Because the question for investors, diplomats, and neighboring states is no longer just whether the accusation is true. The question is, why does the accusation keep returning from so many directions at exactly the same time the RSF is becoming politically radioactive? Then there is Yemen. And Yemen is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The UAE-backed STC was useful for years precisely because it gave Abu Dhabi local reach without direct annexation, formal occupation, or overt responsibility. That mattered because the UAE's regional strength always depended on managing contradictions better than everyone else. Back Israel quietly, but stay acceptable in the Arab world. Back local separatists, but remain inside Gulf consensus. Build commercial ports, but preserve strategic ambiguity. Expand influence without triggering a balancing coalition. That balancing act was unraveling. In Yemen, the STC was no longer just a useful pressure point. It was becoming evidence that Abu Dhabi's interests and Riyadh's interests were not aligned. And once Saudi Arabia begins seeing your local clients not as assets, but as destabilizers, the whole game changes. Then the Horn of Africa delivered another blow. Somalia's government said it was canceling all agreements with the UAE over alleged violations of sovereignty and unity. This is bigger than a bilateral spat, because if Somalia, backed by outside partners and regional sympathy, decides Emirati infrastructure is no longer neutral business but geopolitical interference, then the East India Company logic stops working. The port is no longer just a port. The contract is no longer just a contract. The runway is no longer just a runway. Everything becomes political. Everything becomes visible. Everything becomes contestable. And that is the independent pattern running through all three theaters: Sudan, Yemen, the Horn. Different wars, different actors, different local histories, but the same strategic problem. The UAE built reach through systems that looked modular and flexible. Ports, clients, advisors, private channels, selective investment. That helped it move fast. But it also meant every theater depended on conditions outside Abu Dhabi's direct control. Local partners staying useful. Regional powers staying tolerant. Global media staying distracted. Commercial image staying intact. By 2026, all four conditions were deteriorating at once. And that is why this story is not just about one failed proxy, one bad ally, or one embarrassing diplomatic rupture. It is about structural overreach. A state can buy access. It can finance leverage. It can rent influence. But can it sustain a whole regional order built on borrowed people, borrowed militias, borrowed legitimacy, and permanently blurred responsibility? That is the question 2026 is now forcing into the open. And the deeper you look at the evidence, the harder it becomes to answer with confidence. Because if the empire only worked while nobody connected the dots, what happens now that the dots are glowing? Now we get to the point where this stops being a theory and becomes a timeline of humiliation. Because empires do not really die when critics accuse them. They die when events start stacking up faster than the propaganda can contain them. And in early 2026, that is exactly what began happening to the UAE's regional project. One front after another, one proof point after another, one shock after another. First, Yemen. This was supposed to be the UAE's most polished proxy success. The STC had money, organization, political branding, and years of backing. It was the kind of force that made Abu Dhabi's model look sophisticated. Local face, foreign backing, strategic outcome. Then it overreached. The UAE-backed STC announced a constitution for an independent southern state called the State of South Arabia. That was not a minor political statement. That was a direct challenge to the Saudi-backed Yemeni order. And then came the response. Within days, Saudi-backed forces hit back. Think about what that means. The UAE's signature proxy in southern Yemen tried to turn influence into statehood. And Saudi Arabia answered by showing exactly who still controlled escalation. That is not just a battlefield setback. That is the destruction of the illusion that Abu Dhabi could permanently shape Yemen against Riyadh's will. And the symbolism was devastating. The STC's separatist constitution was supposed to look like the birth of a new reality. Instead, it looked like the moment the entire Emirati project in Yemen went too far and got slapped back into place. Then Sudan exploded into something even more toxic. And all of this was unfolding as the humanitarian nightmare in Sudan got even worse. Pause on that for a second. A proxy army under genocide-level scrutiny. International reporting connecting external support channels to that same ecosystem. This is the nightmare scenario for any state that built influence through deniable clients. Because at that point, every gold shipment looks different. Every cargo plane looks different. Every silence looks different. And then came the Horn of Africa. For years, Berbera looked like one of the UAE's smartest long bets. A port investment, a logistics foothold, a commercial anchor with strategic upside. Then the political climate turned. Somalia canceled all agreements with the UAE, saying it had evidence Abu Dhabi was undermining Somali sovereignty and unity. That matters, because once a host government declares your activities hostile, your commercial footprint stops looking like development. It starts looking like infiltration. And that is exactly the perception shift the UAE could least afford. Now add those fronts together. Yemen. The STC gambles on independence and gets rolled back. Sudan. Structured support allegations surface as the RSF is engulfed in atrocity accusations. Somalia. Mogadishu cancels all UAE agreements and frames Abu Dhabi as a sovereignty threat. That is not normal regional turbulence. That is pattern recognition. And then there is the vulnerability inside the UAE itself, the part that makes all of this even more dangerous. The Emirati system is not just projecting power outward, it is continuously managing dependence inward. It needs outside labor, outside talent, outside money, outside confidence. So when regional headlines start tying your name to separatist gambles, sovereignty blowback, war crimes investigations, and proxy instability, that is not just foreign policy embarrassment. That is a reputational threat to the very model keeping the machine running. And that is why these 2026 proof points hit differently. Because they do not just show friction, they show exposure. They show the UAE's strategy becoming visible in places where visibility is fatal. They show proxies acting too openly, partners pushing back too publicly, accusations sticking too concretely, and neighboring states deciding they are no longer willing to absorb the consequences of Abu Dhabi's shadow games. This is how collapse really starts. Not always with invasion, not always with bankruptcy, not always with revolt. Sometimes it starts with the moment every theater you touched suddenly begins producing evidence at the same time. And once that happens, the question is no longer whether the empire is under pressure. The question becomes far darker. How many more fronts can a shadow empire survive once it is forced into the light? Because it is the possibility that the entire regional balance is about to be rewritten by the very powers the UAE spent a decade trying to outmaneuver. So what happens when a shadow empire starts collapsing in one of the most strategic regions on Earth? That is the question that turns this from a regional drama into a global threat. Because the UAE's influence was never just about prestige. It sat across shipping lanes, port chains, gold routes, energy corridors, intelligence partnerships, and proxy systems that linked Africa, the Gulf, and South Asia. So if that structure weakens, the consequences do not stay local, they spread. Start with maritime trade. The Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb corridor are not optional lanes in the global economy. They are arteries. When that space becomes unstable, the cost hits shipping times, insurance, fuel, and supply chains far beyond the Middle East. Now think about what the UAE tried to become. A quiet gatekeeper, a port empire, a state sitting inside the logistics nervous system of Eurasia and Africa. If that model fractures, then the fight over who controls access does not disappear. It intensifies. Saudi Arabia pushes harder, Turkey pushes harder, Egypt pushes harder. India watches every corridor more closely. Israel calculates differently. And every militia, every breakaway authority, every coastal faction suddenly becomes more valuable to outside powers. That means more competition around choke points, not less. And more competition around choke points means higher risk of miscalculation. A damaged proxy in Yemen can threaten shipping. A collapsing front in Sudan can disrupt hinterland routes and migration patterns. A sovereignty crisis in Somalia can turn port infrastructure into a geopolitical flashpoint. This is how small state overreach creates large system instability. Then there is the regional power balance. For years, the UAE's model depended on the idea that bigger states would tolerate its freelancing because it was useful, efficient, and deniable. But 2026 suggests something else may be happening. A counterblock is forming. That is not a small detail. Because once larger regional powers begin coordinating against the kind of fragmented proxy order the UAE benefited from, the whole environment changes. The old gray zone shrinks. The tolerance for separatist gambles drops. And states that once maneuvered in the shadows find themselves facing clearer red lines. In other words, the UAE may not just be losing ground. It may be losing the era that made its strategy possible. And then there is India. This matters more than it seems. When Abu Dhabi deepened ties with New Delhi in early 2026, it looked like a pivot toward a wider Asian safety net. That is smart politics. But it is also revealing, because states pivot when they see constraints. They diversify when their neighborhood becomes dangerous. They reach for distant partners when nearby trust is eroding. So the India move may not just signal confidence. It may signal necessity. Now zoom out even further. What happens if the UAE can no longer rely on shadow influence to shape the Red Sea, Yemen, Sudan, and the Horn? The vacuum does not stay empty. That is the most dangerous illusion in geopolitics. The belief that when one power retreats, stability automatically follows. It doesn't. Sometimes the vacuum is filled by stronger states. sometimes by warlords, sometimes by smugglers, sometimes by rival blocs, sometimes by ideology, sometimes by pure chaos. And in this case, all of those forces are already present. That means the collapse of one outside patronage system does not end the violence. It can actually make the scramble worse. More desperate funding, more covert resupply, more bidding wars for loyalty, more factions trying to survive long enough to be adopted by the next sponsor. And that is where the danger becomes global. Because once conflict zones become marketplaces for competing regional powers, they stop being isolated wars. They become engines of chronic instability. And then we come to the ultimate vulnerability of the Emirati model. Home. The UAE remains wealthy, connected, and far from collapse as a state. But it is also demographically unusual. That does not make the UAE weak, but it does make it unusually dependent on perception. It needs confidence. It needs inflows. It needs the image of safety. It needs the world to keep believing that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are insulated from the chaos around them. So the long-term risk is not that tanks roll into the Emirates. The long-term risk is subtler, that the country's brand begins carrying more geopolitical baggage than its model can comfortably absorb. Every accusation matters more. Every proxy scandal matters more. Every sovereignty dispute matters more. Every tie to a toxic battlefield matters more. Because in a system built on trust, mobility, and global capital, reputational erosion can become a strategic threat all by itself. And that brings us to the real forecast. If this trajectory continues, the next decade may not be defined by the rise of one unstoppable Middle Eastern superpower, but by a harsher competition between blocs, a Saudi-led security corps trying to impose order, a Turkish expansion of military-industrial reach, an Indian economic corridor strategy linking the Gulf to Asia, an Israel-centered intelligence architecture seeking coastal anchors, and beneath all of it, unresolved wars in Yemen and Sudan, still producing chaos faster than diplomacy can contain it. So no, the end game is not clean. It is not a neat transfer of power. It is a more fragmented, more dangerous Middle East, where the fall of one shadow empire could trigger an even larger struggle over who gets to rule the ruins. And that leaves one terrifying question hanging over everything. If the UAE's model really is failing, who inherits the system it built, and will they be any less dangerous? So this is where it all leads. Not to a clean ending, not to a triumphant reset, not to some neat geopolitical lesson wrapped up in a headline, but to a far darker realization. The UAE may have spent a decade building one of the most sophisticated shadow influence systems in the modern Middle East. Ports, proxies, intelligence links, commercial footholds, political leverage, and yet the very tools that made it look powerful may also be the tools now turning against it. That is the real tragedy of the Emirati model. It was brilliant enough to expand, but maybe never strong enough to endure exposure. It could buy access, but not loyalty. It could finance militias, but not control what those militias would become. It could build ports, but not guarantee that the governments around those ports would keep accepting Emirati influence forever. It could project the image of stability, but not permanently insulate itself from the instability it helps shape. And once that contradiction becomes visible, once enough actors decide they are done tolerating the game, the whole structure starts feeling less like an empire and more like a very expensive illusion. That does not mean the UAE is finished as a state. Far from it. It is still wealthy, still connected, still diplomatically agile, still one of the most commercially important hubs in the region. Its strategic pivot toward India and wider Asian partnerships shows that Abu Dhabi is not standing still. But that is exactly why this moment matters so much. Because what we may be watching is not the destruction of the UAE, but the destruction of the myth that the UAE could indefinitely dominate the region through shadows alone. And if that myth is dying, then the whole Middle East enters a new phase. A phase where Saudi Arabia pushes harder to define order, where Turkey expands its security footprint, where Pakistan becomes more relevant to Gulf deterrence, where India becomes a lifeline for economic diversification, where African and Red Sea states become battlegrounds for competing external visions. and where every unresolved war, Yemen, Sudan, the Horn, becomes more dangerous precisely because the old, unofficial rules are breaking down. So the final question is no longer whether the UAE overreached. It did. The final question is what comes after. Does Saudi Arabia succeed in building a new regional order around stronger state control? Does Turkey lock in a bigger role across the Red Sea and Horn? Does the UAE reinvent itself as an Asian-facing commercial fortress and quietly retreat from the dirtiest proxy battles? Or does the collapse of one shadow architecture simply unleash a more open, more brutal competition for the same fractured spaces? Because history gives us one warning again and again. When empires retreat from unstable frontiers, the violence they leave behind rarely disappears with them. It mutates. And that may be the most terrifying part of this entire story. The proxies may be weakened, the corridors may be contested, the shadow empire may be cracking, but the chaos is still there. The weapons are still there. The grievances are still there. The shipping lanes are still there. The money is still there. The ambition is still there. So if the Emirati model really is collapsing, someone else is going to step into the vacuum, and the next player may not care nearly as much about appearances. So, was the UAE the future of modern power? Or was it the final warning of what happens when a small state tries to play empire with rented influence, borrowed manpower, and permanent deniability? And more importantly, how long before the next shadow power makes the exact same mistake? If this video opened your eyes to the real story behind the UAE's hidden collapse, subscribe to Audio Insight right now. We break down the slow-burning disasters, the buried geopolitical fractures, and the power shifts that most people only notice when it is already too late. Hit like if you want more deep collapse analysis. Comment below. How long do you think the UAE's regional model has left? And share this with someone who still thinks Gulf power is only about skyscrapers, oil, and headlines. Because here on Audio Insight, we follow the cracks before the collapse becomes obvious. Next video teaser: the Muslim NATO, the new alliance that could redraw the Middle East forever.